Right, thank you very much. I'm really pleased to join you at this event, and thank you for the invitation, Elizabeth. I loved your point about gender-blind science earlier. I do think whoever designed lapel mics never thought the speaker might wear a dress without pockets or belt. so this is a micro example of how we live in organizations that don't always design things for women. A lot of the points we've heard earlier are reflective of this notion that fundamentally work and organizations have been set up by men and for men with a model of family structure that I think no longer applies in current society. So I come here in my capacity as a researcher, unlike the speakers you've heard before who provided such brilliant examples of diversity work within their organizations. I'm not going to speak about my organization as such, but about my research in the area of diversity and inclusion. I have conducted research in this area as a social scientist for 10 years now, and my main area of work is diversity and leadership, particularly women leaders, women on boards, and I have co-authored the official census for women on boards in the UK for a decade now. So what I'll try to achieve with this brief talk is really give you a bit of a background about the debate on women on boards in the UK. A lot of my research is with corporates, private sector, but I think why this conversation is relevant in this context is because it provides some lessons that all of us hopefully can draw from and apply within our organizations, whether they are research institutes, higher education spaces, and so on. I'm just curious, how many of you are familiar with the Davis Review and the debate on women on boards in the UK? Can I just have a show of hands? All right, a few of you, usual suspects, yeah. But I just want to give you a bit of background as to why this is important and how the conversation has unfolded in different countries. We've heard the reasons for diversity in science and research. Diversity does create more innovative teams, generally better working teams. It does allow companies to be more responsive to customer needs. It's really hard to sort of have an enlightened decision-making body if that senior leadership team doesn't reflect the customers you're trying to serve. It's also, I think, the right thing to do from a moral standpoint, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to underutilize half of your talent pool. And so with this in mind, the UK has actually been one of the pioneers for monitoring gender diversity on boards. It started in 1999, and the percentage at that point was quite abysmal, about 6% women directors on what we call FTSE 100 boards. That's the Financial Times Stock Exchange. The top 100 companies listed in the Financial Times Stock Exchange. And you may be familiar with the notion that in the UK, corporate governance doesn't get very enthused about the notion of the state intervening. So not a lot of regulation, unlike countries like Norway, where gender quotas have been imposed. This trend has expanded in other European countries. In recent years, we have quotas in France and Spain and quite a few others. The UK doesn't have and never has had quotas for gender on boards. The approach has been staunchly voluntary. Whether that's right or wrong, that's another debate, but the corporate governance system here works under the principle of comply or explain. That is, we set some general principles of good governance, diversity is one of them. You as a company have to explain, if you're not complying to those principles, why that's the case in your annual reports. So it requires quite a lot of reliance on the goodwill and initiative of people. With this approach, from the late 90s to 2010, the pace of increase for women on corporate boards has been about 6% in 10 years. So from 6% to about 12%, quite abysmal, quite glacial pace of change, obviously a sense of collective frustration built up, I think. And 2010 has been a turning point. It's where the government has set up what's called the Davis Review. Lord Davis used to be a minister, but he's also a businessman, quite respected by the business community. And the approach of this review has been, again, not to impose government quotas, but rather to gather together the senior leaders of FTSE 100 companies and other stakeholders in the field, whether it's headhunters, investors, women's associations, leading senior women themselves, to kind of diagnose the problem and set up a number of solutions. And what was, I think, quite revolutionary for the agenda that the Davis Review has set in 2010 was that from all the top 10 recommendations for change that were laid out, none of them had to do with what women themselves should do differently. And I think that's quite important, because a lot of time when we talk about gender equality and changing organizations towards that, the implicit message is that women need to change. You know, they're not self-confident enough, not self-promoting enough. You need to behave more like a man, basically, to be noticed, to be promoted, and so on. And this review actually said, you know what, we know that there's female talent out there that's not used. It's not about women not having the right experience. It's about every other stakeholder realizing that that's the case and doing something about it. So it set recommendations for chairman, boards, to have diversity policies, to publish them, to set themselves aspirational targets, to explain how they're going to meet these targets, why aren't they meeting them. Crucially, it set recommendations for headhunters, those who recruit those senior peoples in those jobs, to actually create a code of practice and ask themselves, you know, what does senior talent look like? What's the definition of a good leader? And that's, I think, gendered, and it can also vary across cultures, as Jean mentioned before. So a lot of these initiatives have been monitored. The key driving force for the change that we've seen in the 5 years from 2010 to 2015 has been that the Davis Review set a target of 25% women on boards. This was a voluntary target again. No company was punished by law for not doing so. But what the review did is really create a sense of institutional pressure and momentum. And year by year, there's monitoring, there's publishing of top companies who are doing great work in the area, of the laggards, those who have all-male boards. Actually, we no longer have all-male boards in the FTSE 100 now, thanks to that. In 5 years, the percentage of women on boards has risen from about 12% to about 26%. And now we're at around 28%. So it is a success story overall. There are some sort of finer details that, where perhaps progress hasn't been made as quickly as we would like. But from the perspective of creating change without state-imposed legislation, I think it's fair to say that the UK is probably the most hopeful and successful example of raising the share of women on boards without gender quotas. The conversation is now extending to the pipeline of women, because fundamentally that's where the problem is. You can't expect to have women on boards if you don't grow your talent pipeline below boards. So now the new Hampton-Alexander review has set a new target of 33% women at the level below boards, and that's executive committees. And from my perspective, that's where the real interesting conversation starts to begin, because if you don't engage HR directors to actually set up those policies and create talent all throughout the pipeline, then there's really not much point in complaining that we don't have women at the very top. So one takeaway from all these initiatives that I think it's worth bearing in mind is the value of targets, voluntary targets. And I think targets are important because they create a sense of urgency, and they treat diversity as a business objective or a performance indicator for organizations. If we are serious about driving diversity, right, we need to do something about it. It can't just be lofty, vague statements of how much we value diversity. It has to actually be translated into objectives. And if you want to set an you set business or performance objectives for anything. As scientists, we're assessed by how many papers we publish, how much funding we bring in, and so on and so forth. Why wouldn't you, as an organization, set yourself an objective to increase diversity? And that can be a number, actually. It can be a number that is determined by the context in which your organization operates. So it can be sensitive to the pipelines of talent you can find in the market. It can be a number that's not only about outcomes, but also about process. So targets do provide clarity in goals and a disciplined approach to change. And just to give you a few examples of the kinds of targets that are used in the corporate sector, the Royal Bank of Scotland set a target in 2013 to have 30% women in their top 5,000 roles by 2020. And this target is then tailored for each business function based on their pools of talent, right? So targets are also effective when they're underpinned by metrics, and I really can't emphasize how important it is to just track gender representation at different levels. I know it sounds very basic, but we actually, till 1 or 2 years ago in the UK, we did not have any official database for women below boards, so there's not even a sense of how this amounts as a picture of gender balance. So you have to know what are your incoming pools of talent and how they translate into promotions and senior level talent. And professional services firms such as KPMG or EY have embraced this principle of proportionality in promotions. Has anyone heard of this before? Yeah, so it's a really just common sense idea that the rate of promotions should reflect the talent pools you have. So if your intake at graduate level is, say, 30% women in a line of work, then 5 or 10 years down the line, you should roughly expect to see maybe not 30, but at least 20, 25% of those women in senior leadership roles. And if that's not the case, you really need to ask yourself why that's the case. You know, we often hear about choice. You know, choices are forced. Career choices aren't made in a vacuum. So, you know, to what extent does your organization accommodate career breaks, flexible working? To what extent unconscious bias plays out in the way people make promotion decisions? These are hard questions that I think any organization should ask. And importantly, I think targets frame diversity as a culture change and not only as women's issues. And I think to create culture change is quite nebulous. When you say, oh, we need to change the culture, well, who's supposed to do it, when, how? You know, you really need to put some meat on the bone and explain what are the processes that are going to drive this change. And I think a key innovative practice we've seen among the private sector is to create leadership accountability for diversity objectives. So organizations such as GlaxoSmithKline, again relevant for those in STEM, embed performance objectives in the way they assess and reward leaders. So it's really important to hardwire these values into actual behaviors. So really, what are the lessons that I think we can learn and perhaps start reflecting on and debating about how we can transfer this? Diversity as a value, as an aspiration is good, but it needs to be more than a lofty statement. It needs to be actual practice. It needs to go into the fine detail of what we have to do in terms of talent management practices. So voluntary approach, no quotas, does work, but only if we have this very pragmatic, detailed approach to things. I think we need to expand the area of the advocates of change. It can't just be women who advocate for diversity. We have to have more senior men, younger men, and so on and so forth. And I think it's worth asking ourselves, you know, what can we learn from this? How can we transfer some of this practice that we see in the private sector in other areas? A lot of universities talk about Athena Swan, yeah, this notion of embedding gender equality in STEM careers. I'm part of the Athena Swan committee in my own university, and I can tell you that some of the conversations are really difficult around that, because you really need to start thinking of basic things like anybody who's a researcher here and who had the grant, you may be aware that some research grants don't stop the clock for maternity leave. It's such a basic thing. If you have a 2-year grant and you're on maternity leave even for 6 months, but your funding doesn't runs out for those 6 months, it's just a massive career penalty that one shouldn't have to incur as a parent. So I'd love to talk more about this in the conversation that follows, but I hope these lessons will inspire all of us here. Thank you.